In a previous lesson, I showed you how to create this sketch, and now we'll be using this sketch to create a painting in color. This sketch is on a separate layer. I'm going to go ahead and create a layer beneath that sketch. I'll be adding my paint to that layer. I'm going to go to my brush selector, and I'm going to choose the selection brushes category and the comic flatting variant. I'll toggle it to add to selection in the properties bar, and I'll go ahead and just show my overlay. And what I want to do is I want to just paint right along the edges here because I'm going to be filling this in. If I need to erase, I can switch to the subtractive mode and I can erase as well. I'll switch back to adding paint, and I'll go ahead and just use a bigger brush just to fill in the middle now since I painted along the edges. Then we don't really have to worry about those. So this gives us a selection that we can trap our paint inside of. I'm going to go ahead and open my mixer, and my mixer is preloaded with my color gamut masking tool. I'm going to select this neutral gray swatch up here at the top, and I'll fill my selection with that color. I'll go ahead and deselect my active selection with Control D, and now you can see we've just filled that in with that flat gray color. If there happen to be any spots that got missed by the selection, you can feel free to use the smooth scratch board just to clean those up using that same gray color. It doesn't hurt to zoom in and just double check just to make sure that you didn't miss anything. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch to my eraser tool, and I'm going to clean up the edges a little bit. And once I'm happy with how the silhouette of this painting looks, I'm going to go ahead and start choosing a color scheme. I'm going to open my color gamut masking tool. I can use this to limit the colors in my palette, which will make it easier to paint. So first I want to establish the tone of my skin. So I'm going to try some different yellow oranges and red oranges until I get a color that I like. I'm sampling a color from my gamut, and then I'm using the sliders in my compact color panel just to preview that color. And if I move the value and saturation sliders, I can kind of preview how different shades of that color might look. And then once I've established my base color, I'm going to experiment with the different modes. All I need to do is show the visibility of the mode that I want to experiment with. I'm going to use triadic, and then I can free transform this using Control T and rotate it around, and I can point it at the different colors that I want in my scheme. I'm going to try a different mode. Let's try atmospheric triad. So I'm pointing the arrow at my dominant color, whatever I want that to be, and looking at what colors are encompassed by the other corners of the triangle. Let's try one more mode, dominant hue with accent. We'll see how that looks. I think I like atmospheric triad the best, so I'm going to stick with that. My dominant color is going to be this reddish color, which I'll use for some reflected light. And I've also encompassed some skin tones, some yellow for the eyes, and some red, violets, and purples. Then I want to select the crop tool, and I'll just crop out the color gamut mask and get rid of everything else. I'll go to File, Save As, and I want to save a copy of this so I don't save over my original. I'll save it as a Painter riff, and then I'll open that file as a mixer pad in my mixer panel, and if I switch back to my painting, it appears in the mixer panel there. So I'm going to go ahead and just name this gray fill outline so we know what it is. Then I'll right-click on that layer and I'll choose Select Layer Content. That creates a new selection based on the outline of that layer. I'll create a new layer to paint on, and I'm going to go ahead and sample one of these flesh tone orange colors. I'll select a brush in my palette knives category called Smooth Palette Knife, and I'm going to go ahead and just put down a little test blob of color here. I might tweak that color a bit and just try to find a color that I like for my base skin color. I think I like that, so I'll go ahead and just fill in the face with that color. It can be helpful to save some of these colors for later, so what you could do is click on a color in the color set library, sample the color that you want to add, and then click the plus button. And now you can save that exact swatch of paint to use later. I'm going to go ahead and select a brownish color now for my hair, and I'll go ahead and just fill that in. It may be good to fill that in on a separate layer. I didn't do that this time around, but I'll show you how you can fix that later by separating layers that are combined. Now you may notice that this brush adds paint and blends at the same time. So as you paint, it adds paint, but it eventually runs out and then works like a blender. So you'll need to pick your pen up to load more paint. You may also notice that you can't paint on the background, and that's because you're painting within a selection. I'm going to go ahead and save that brown swatch. Now I'm going to go ahead and sample a yellowish color here, and I'm going to select a yellowish color for my eyes and my teeth, and I'll fill that in. I'm going to have some red color reflected on my face from a light that's kind of off to the side. So that red is my dominant color, and it's the most intense color here in my gamut. So I'm going to go ahead and sample that red color. Just try a little bit on the face and see how it looks. Now here's where I should have separated my hair and my skin and my shirt, because now when I paint on the face, it also paints on the hair. Now that may or may not be the kind of effect that you want. In this case, it's okay because I want that light to kind of bleed onto everything, so I don't mind if it's there right now. I'll separate the face from the hair in just a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and select one of those purplish colors now. And we can use that just to kind of complement the other colors in our painting. I'll make it darker and I'll just fill the background with that. Now to make it easier, I want my shirt to be separate from my face. So what I want to do is go ahead and select that outline layer. That's the whole silhouette of my painting. And I'll select the freeform lasso tool. And I'm going to just go ahead and make a selection that encompasses the shirt. And I'm going to try to get very little of the face. I'll cut that and paste it. It pastes onto a new layer. Now it's separate from the face and I can call that layer shirt outline. And I want to make sure that the head layer is nice and clean. So I'm going to hide some of those layers just so I'm seeing only the head. And then I want to clean up the edge right along the jawline with the eraser. If you happen to see anything else that needs cleaning up, feel free to do that. On that same outline layer, I'm going to use the lasso selection tool to go ahead and select only the hair. And I'll separate that onto its own layer by cutting and pasting it. I'll name that layer hair outline. That way we know what it is. And we'll change that other layer to face outline. That way it's more specific. So the reason why we're doing this is so that we can make these selections later to trap our paint within just the hair, just the face, or just the shirt. You'll see the magic of why we're doing that a little bit later in this process. I'm going to reduce the opacity to 0 on all of those outline layers. And now we can right click on them and get a selection from them at any time. So now if I create a new layer above that layer 1 and I call that shirt, I can go ahead and just fill that with a darker purple color. And now the paint for that shirt is on its own separate layer. I'm going to create a selection from the hair outline. And then I'm going to go to that layer 1. That has the paint for my hair and skin combined into a single layer. I'll just cut the hair with Control X and paste it with Control V. Then it goes onto its own layer. I'll name that layer hair and I'll move it above the shirt layer. And that just leaves the skin on that layer, which we'll name skin, and we'll move that above the shirt as well. Now I'm going to need to clean up that paint that got spilled over the edge there, so I'll just use the eraser. I'm having to waste time cleaning things up, which is really inefficient, so that's why it would have made more sense to separate my hair and my skin and my shirt earlier in the process. Now I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency and select the shirt layer. I'm going to select the smooth palette knife, and I'll select that red color, and I will paint onto the shirt, and Preserve Transparency will allow me to paint within the shirt and not on the background. I'll let the paint blend into the darker color as I paint. I'm going to sample the purple from the background now, and I'm going to blend that into the shirt on the opposite side. It might be good to indicate the flow of the fabric and the creases in the material. Now I'll select that hair layer and I'll reflect some purple into that as well. And I'll select the skin layer and I'll reflect some purple onto that as well. So the purple's kind of the shadow side. The primary light's going to be kind of on the left, and on the right will be that red reflected light. Now I ended up painting over the eyes and the teeth. It wasn't worth it to separate those layers, so I'll create a new layer for eyes highlight, and I'll go ahead and paint those in. I'll need to turn off Preserve Transparency before I'll be able to paint on that new layer, and I'll just use an almost white color to paint in some highlights on the eyes. I'll go ahead and save that color as a swatch. Now I'm going to select that red color, and I'll reflect a little spot of that in the eyes, pointed toward the side that the red light is coming from. Beneath that layer, I'll create a new layer called Eyes. I'll sample the color that's in the eye area, and I'll just make that lighter. I'll use a lighter pen pressure just to kind of blend it in. Then I'll sample the color from the red side of the eye, and I'll put that in. Now I'm going to choose a yellow-green hue and desaturate it a bit, and I'll put in some eye color on the iris. I think that's a bit too bright for my liking, so I'm going to desaturate it a bit more. It's basically gray, but it reads as green. Then I'll select the Diffuse Blur Blender, and I'm going to blend up some of those harsh transitions in the face to soften them out. Now I'm going to add some shading to the face. I'm going to select a brush in the glazing category called Soft. I'm going to set the merge mode to multiply. I'll select a middle gray color, and I'll go ahead and just paint in using lighter pressure to get a thinner glaze or heavier pressure to get a thicker glaze. This works really great for shading the face. So what I'm looking for are areas that are facing away from the light or areas that are sunken in, and those areas will typically be darker. This adds form to the face and helps it look more three-dimensional. Now because that selection of my face is no longer active, I can accidentally paint outside the face, which I don't want to do, so I want to undo. And then I want to make sure that I'm using a selection from the face outline or that I'm using Preserve Transparency on the face layer that I'm painting on. That way I don't accidentally paint on the background or outside of the face. Once I've added some basic shading to the face, I'm going to go to the eyes layer. I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency so that I don't paint outside the eyes, and I'll add some shading to the eyes. I'm going to sample one of those lighter colors from the eyes, set the merge mode to screen for that brush, select the skin layer, and I'm going to lighten the face and the teeth. So kind of opposite to how we were doing when we were adding some shading or dark areas to the face, we want to look for the areas that are facing the light and areas that are bulging out, and those areas will typically be the lightest. But don't cover your face entirely with highlights and shadows, you do need to leave some midtones as well. Now I'm going to get a selection from my shirt outline, and on my shirt layer I'm going to go ahead and lighten that a little bit using that same brush with the screen merge mode. I'll sample that purple color I'm painting on top of, that way it'll just make that purple lighter. So that's one way of keeping your paint within a selection. It's actually usually faster to use preserve transparency. So I'm going to select all of the outline layers, increase their opacity to 100%, and then I'll move them underneath their companion layers and merge them together. Then we'll have just one layer for each of those individual elements. I'll go ahead and save my progress by going to Save As. And I'm going to save a numbered iteration here so I can go back and see my progress, or maybe go back if I made a mistake. I'm going to go to that face layer, turn on Preserve Transparency, select the Smooth Palette Knife, and I'll select Red. I'll also need to deselect that selection from the shirt to be able to paint on the face. And what I'm painting in is some red highlights reflected onto the face. This red color will be nearly the brightest color of the red reflection. We'll be able to see that more clearly in just a minute. This light is not pointed directly at the front of the face, it's pointed kind of to the side of the face, and so it's only going to be reflected on objects that are facing the red light. Now I want to create a new layer above all my other layers, turn off Preserve Transparency. I'll go ahead and just fill that layer with black. Then I'll change the composite method to color. This gets rid of all of the color in the piece temporarily so I can see only the values or the light and dark areas. So as you can see, that red color appears very, very light, almost white. And if we paint with that color on the hair layer in this mode, then you can see it looks very much like a highlight. So we're going to need to darken that up a bit on the shadow side so it looks more realistic. I'm going to select the face layer, and I'm going to darken that red color a bit. And I'm going to paint next to the nose there and in the corner of the eyes with an even darker red. Now you can see that it looks a bit more balanced in terms of values, but I'm still getting that red reflection. I'm going to select a blender called Smooth Knife Blender, and I'm just going to blend out that transition there. You have to be a little bit careful with this brush because it can destroy some of your detail, but it does mix the paint together really nicely to create intermediate tones, so it works really well for that. I'm just going to kind of paint around on the face here just to smooth things out a bit. Next, I'm going to select a brush that's called Pinch, and I can paint along the edges of the face just to kind of pull those pixels in together and sculpt them into a cleaner, smoother shape. Now at this point, I don't really need the hair and all the facial features to be separate from the head, so I'll just merge all of those face layers together into a layer called Head. Then I can work between blending and painting just to kind of clean up some of those transitions. I'll also clean up some of the edges, like on the face there. And then now I'm just repeating a lot of those steps, adding paint, blending paint, doing some glazing here and there. And I'm really just kind of refining it. I started out with big, broad details, and now I'm working toward finer, smaller details. I have the reference photo of the pose that I was using, but the lighting in that reference photo doesn't necessarily match what I see in my mind, and so a lot of this lighting I'm just doing kind of from imagination. I'm experimenting as I'm painting, and so I might put down some colors, see that I don't like their result, and then do some undos and try something else. It's okay to try something and decide that you don't like it. It's okay to paint over something that you already painted. This kind of back and forth or iterative process really helps you get a nice effect because it looks like a painting that you put effort into rather than something that's just too clean and too perfect. As I'm painting, I'm going to use Save As to save iterations of my work. That way I can try stuff, and if I don't like what I did, if I do something major, then I can always go back to that older version without having to start over from the very beginning. Now, in addition to my reference photo showing the pose of my face, I also have an anatomical skull model, which actually has a primary light on it in the room and a secondary red light off to the side. Now it doesn't look exactly like my face, it's obviously a skull and my face has different details on it, but the skull does give you an idea of the three-dimensional contours of the face, and you can see the light playing on those details, so that's actually a really helpful reference. I also downloaded a reference of a person with a red light shining on the side of their face, so I can get an idea of what those colors might look like. Starting out, I really just kind of improvised and didn't use the references as much, but then later in the painting process, I referenced them a little bit more heavily. So I'm just going to continue adding detail, and eventually I will be taking a break here. I'll stop working on this piece, and I'll just kind of look at it and spend some time looking for mistakes and just thinking about how I feel about the piece overall. You don't want to rush through the painting, that's the best way to have it look unfinished. And you also don't want to destroy your hand from painting too long. So after my break, I came to the conclusion that the red side of the face is just too light, especially when I view it with my value check here. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new layer on top of that face, and I'm just going to glaze it or darken it a little bit. And then I can play with that just to refine it. But overall, I want to know that that side of the face is darker than the light side of the face because it needs to be. Now there will be some areas on the shadow side of the face that will be a bit brighter, but we want them to be not as bright as the highlight side of the face. So we can bring back in some of those highlights. I'm using this soft glazing brush with a screen merge mode, and doing that kind of wraps the shadow around the contours of the face. And I'll just use a smaller brush to bring in some little highlights and finer details. I don't need that sketch layer, so I'll delete that, and I'll go ahead and save a copy of my work. Now I'll blend the face a bit using the diffuse blur blender. I don't want to blur up all of my nice details, but just kind of hit it here and there in some places where it's a bit too sharp. I'm going to sharpen up the detail on the eyes as well using the smooth palette knife. It may be helpful to zoom in so you can get in here nice and close and just make sure that your iris is round. The eyes are really the focal point of most portraits, and so you want to make sure that your eyes look pretty good. And you'll notice that I'm only using a few brushes and just going back and forth between them depending on the kind of look that I want to get. And then occasionally I'll use that value check mode just to make sure everything is staying in the proper value. You'll notice I'm doing a lot of these short little strokes in small areas, and there are small areas on the face that you have to be able to add the right amount of detail to. So you need to look for those in your reference image and make sure that you're putting those into your painting. It's up to you how detailed you want to get. You certainly can do something that's a bit more impressionistic and that would look great. At this point, my biggest challenge is really getting that red light on the side of the face to look at least halfway decent. It started out way too bright and now I'm just trying to kind of rein it in. Now as I'm working, you'll see me zoom in and zoom out. Zooming out is really important because it gives you an idea of how the painting is going to look overall. If you focus too much on the fine details and things that are up close, then you can lose sight of the bigger picture. Another thing that you want to make sure to have in your painting are sharp and smooth areas. Some areas are really sharp, some areas are really smooth, and some are a mix of everything in between. So you can see how I'm making that crease on the upper lip and on the nostril there. Those stand out because I'm giving them a good balance of sharp and smooth. Now I know I'm kind of just jumping around here. That's how my mind works. I do a little bit at a time and just kind of gradually bring the face together evenly rather than like completely drawing the mouth and having the mouth look perfect and then completely drawing the left eye and have that look perfect. I just do a little bit here and there and everywhere to bring the piece together. I just let my mind wander. You know, I look around and I see areas that I don't like and I fix those areas. And sometimes it takes just working on the piece for a while to see areas that you're not happy with or to get ideas about how you want to progress with the painting. So I do jump around a lot. That's okay to do. You'll notice as I'm painting the eye, that very small tear duct area, I did some undos and it had to be absolutely perfect. As an artist, you know what you want your vision to look like, and so if that tear duct doesn't look right, then undo it and redo it as many times as you need to. But within reason, don't get too bogged down by a tear duct and take, 4 hours to make that one little area perfect, because that tear duct is also going to get viewed probably from further away than you think, and people might not even really notice all that detail. So you do have to balance nitpicking stuff too much and getting it done. Now you might think, well, how am I supposed to know how to shade a nostril or a tear duct? Well, having a physical or digital 3D model can be very helpful to show you how to understand where the lights and shadows go. And then practicing drawing faces, lots and lots of faces, will help you remember the different details of the face and how to shade them. And then eventually you'll be able to improvise because you'll know how light plays on a face. Now, if there's a particular angle that I'm having difficulty drawing, I'm not afraid to rotate my canvas to be able to make that angle easier to draw. So feel free to rotate your canvas as much as you need to. It's important to be comfortable when you're painting because a portrait like this could take you quite a bit of time to complete. And you don't need to complete it all in one session. You can work on it across multiple days or weeks or months or however long you want to spend on it. Another technique that can help you draw more comfortably is to flip your canvas horizontally or vertically. That makes something that was difficult to draw on the left side of the canvas easier to draw because it's now on the right side of the canvas. It also helps you look for mistakes when you flip your canvas like this. I noticed that I need a bit more darker contrast on the shadow side of the hair, so I'm going to go ahead and add that in. I'm just using these quick strokes that kind of follow the contour of the hair. I'm varying my pen pressure to get wider or thinner strokes that taper off, and this smooth palette knife gives me a really great hair effect. Just like I built up the face with highlights and shadows, I can do that for the hair as well, so I'm just adding lighter and darker colors, and that's making the hair look nice and three-dimensional. And I'm not trying to match the hair exactly as it is in my reference photo. I'm really just kind of going for it and making the hair look the way I want to. It turns out much better that way because then I'm just kind of doing more spontaneous strokes that look like natural hair. Now I'm going to move on to adding some finer details to the red side of the face, just focusing more on smaller areas and trying to help those look right and match my reference photo in terms of the anatomy of the face. This process is kind of half reference and half improvisation. So as I'm painting, I'm kind of experimenting and I put stuff down, and if I like it, I keep it. If I don't like it, then I undo or I paint over it or I get rid of it. This is a great way to paint because you don't always know what you want to paint. You don't always know what you want it to look like. You might also not have a reference, and so being able to improvise like this is really the only way to paint some things. I could have, of course, set up a purple light and a red light and made the lighting exactly the way I wanted it, and then taken a better photo of myself and worked from that, but it might not have looked as artistic as this is going to look, because a lot of this is just from my own imagination. And don't be afraid to use your distortion brushes like Distorto and Pinch and Bulge, because sometimes it can be easier just to re-sculpt your face and push the paint around, rather than adding paint or removing paint or blending. These distortion brushes can really help to sharpen up a piece, but they can also make it too sharp, so you need to be careful and make sure you have that balance between smooth and sharp. You can always blend something to soften it, and you can always distort it to sharpen it. I like this smooth palette knife because it gives you a balance of smooth and sharp, and you can use the same brush to get a little bit of each effect. So now we're coming up on a point where I'm going to take another break, and I'm going to kick back and look at my progress and look for mistakes. But this time I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to draw on that new layer and just kind of highlight areas that I want to fix. So those are on a layer that's called Corrections. And I just kind of indicated areas that I wanted to fix, maybe drew the shape that I wanted to kind of morph things into. And I'll just go through here with that layer dimmed quite a bit, or maybe even hidden. And then I'll just try to correct those areas, and if I need to reference that corrections layer, I can turn it back on. But I know that now I need to focus on this corner of the eye because that didn't look right, so I need to make it darker. And this helps me really just put my focus on smaller areas. It helps me collect all of my thoughts and ideas. And if I'm not able to correct all of these areas all in one sitting, I can always go back to that layer and remind myself. Now, looking for mistakes and correcting them is really kind of based on having some knowledge of what you should and shouldn't do when you're painting and what facial anatomy should and should not look like. A lot of this stuff is maybe common sense. You'll look at the painting and you'll go, okay, one eye is bigger than the other, or there aren't enough teeth in the mouth, or something is off. Maybe there's a brush stroke that you didn't notice that's in the wrong place on the background or something. So you'll start to notice that stuff, but also it can be helpful to have maybe other people look at your work and give you critique. If there's a forum where you can post your work, or if you can show your painting to somebody in real life and say, hey, what do you think of this? They might give you some constructive criticism and say, the nose is too big, or it's too small, or, people will always find a way to pick your work apart. So don't take it too personally. Even if you think something is perfect, somebody will always have something to say about it to hopefully, in their mind, make it better. But some people aren't always so constructive. They'll just, tell you don't like it. And that can be discouraging. But the more you practice and the more you paint, the better you're going to get. So expect that your first few faces are going to look a little bit wonky. Now, at this point in the painting, I wouldn't say that my painting looks exactly like my reference photo. I don't want it to look exactly like me in the reference photo, but I want it to have the essence of me. I want somebody to be able to look at it and say, okay, that's supposed to be Aaron Rutten. If it's not 100% perfect, that's okay, because, I'm not paying myself to do a perfect commissioned portrait that I might spend a lot more time on. This is something that's just going to be a single frame in an animation, and the overall point of this painting is to create an animation. But nevertheless, I don't want it to look too sloppy, but at this point it's okay if it is a little bit messed up here and there, because I can always go through and correct things. I have a few different ways I can do that, and so I know that and I'm just trying to focus on getting the bulk of the details in rather than worrying about the eye being the right size or in the right location, because I can tweak that. But it is important to try to get that stuff as accurate as possible in your initial sketch and when you're kind of blocking things in, because it just saves you time and helps you work more efficiently. Now, earlier I said that the eyes were the most important part of the painting. That's true, and you do want to spend a lot of time on the eyes, but you also don't want to neglect other areas of the painting, especially if those are areas that you're not so comfortable painting. Like, let's say you haven't drawn very many mouths, so you don't put much time into the mouth. Well, then that mouth is not going to match the rest of the detail in the painting. So here I'm giving a lot of attention to the mouth, and as I start to look at it, I realize that the front teeth are way too big, so I'm going to need to kind of thin those out, and there needs to actually be more teeth in my mouth. I wasn't paying careful enough attention in my reference image. I just kind of drew in the teeth. Sometimes I have a habit of just drawing things from imagination rather than looking carefully at the reference photo, and sometimes those things get exaggerated or drawn kind of cartoony. Even now, my front two teeth are still way too wide. I look like Bugs Bunny, so I'm going to have to fix that later. But at this point in my painting, I'm just not noticing that. It isn't till later when I notice it and I go, oh, those teeth are way too big. So that's why it's good to just kind of chisel away at it little by little and come back to areas and step away and look at your painting, because you'll see things that you need to fix like that. So that's why it's okay to not get it perfect the very first time. And that's why it's okay to be a little bit more loose about your sketch and about your initial painting, because you can go through and kind of refine things later. You could look at it like you could put a lot more time into your sketch and then you wouldn't have to spend as much time on your painting, or you could put not very much time into the sketch and put more time into the painting. It really comes down to your own personal preference. Now, I mentioned earlier it's good to take breaks so that you can rest your hand. When you're doing a lot of hairs and stuff like this, that's just repetitive short strokes, your hand really does start to cramp up and it actually gets sore, and it's almost to the point to where you have to take a break because you can't draw anymore. So do make sure to take a break and stretch your hand, and don't do this all in one session. Break this up into several sessions if you need to, so that you can take time to look at it and make sure that it looks right, but that you also have time to recover and heal your body. But you can see I'm putting a lot of time and effort into this because I want it to look good. I could go back to near the beginning of this video, and that's where someone could have stopped and said, you know what, that's good enough. That looks just like him. And that's the difference between a portrait that's good and a portrait that looks unfinished. You're going to have to put time into it, and probably more time if you're less experienced. If you're a portrait artist and you do this all the time, then sure, you could probably create a portrait pretty quickly, and some people might consider how much time I spent on this quick, because they spend a lot more time on their portraits. It really comes down to who you are as an artist and how much experience you have, so don't feel like you need to complete this as quickly as I'm completing it. So I'm going to tweak the face here and there with some of the distortion tools. Again, just trying to balance things out and get everything a little bit more in proportion. I'm also thinking about what was on my list of corrections and just referencing that and thinking about all those areas that I needed to fix. If I actually need to look at that later, I can. It's been a while since I've checked the value, so I want to make sure that that all looks right. It's starting to get a little bit light again, so I want to make sure just to bring back in some of that darker contrast so that it's noticeably darker than the light side of the face. The lightest darks should be darker than the darkest lights. Some of what I'm doing is helping areas stand out too. I'm going along the edges and adding some rim or edge highlights, and that's kind of separating the skin from the hair, separating the nostril from the shadow that's next to it with a little bit of rim highlight. Then if I overdo it, I can always fade it back a little bit by blending it. Now I'll go ahead and save a copy of my work, and I'm going to zoom out to evaluate how it's looking. I think it's on the right track. I'll go ahead and flip it horizontally and maybe work on it a little bit that way as well, just to balance out that eye. If something looks off to you, it can be helpful to draw guides on a separate layer. I could circle that eye and then move that guide over to the other eye and just see if one eye is definitely bigger than the other one. And if so, then you could adjust it. I'm going to go ahead and just clean up the mouth a little bit, reshape it. I'm using Distorto for that. I can sharpen up some of the details using pinch around the eyes and the nose. Now earlier I mentioned that you could flip your canvas horizontally and vertically to get a fresh perspective on it and look for mistakes, but you can also rotate your canvas. Proportionately, I'm probably spending the most time on these finer details, and the 80-20 rule kind of applies to this. You can get 80% of the portrait done with 20% of the work, but that last 20% takes 80% more effort. So finishing your painting and getting it looking good is going to take a lot longer than the beginning stages of making the painting. All right, so it's break time. I'm going to save and return to my painting. I've made some observations about the alignment on the face, and I've used these vertical guides just to check that alignment. I can put the center of that guide through the pupil, for example, and then I can see how much distance is between each of those vertical guides. And if I need to kind of nudge stuff around to help the face look more aligned, I can do that. One mistake that I noticed is that my eyes are way too big, so I'll just use the pinch brush just to shrink those down. And then I can draw some guides on a new layer just to check the size of the eye and how far apart they are. I'm going to go ahead and bring back those vertical guides, and I see that my nose needs to shift over just a little bit. My eye needs to shift over, and I'll just align that guide again. Now I think I want to darken some of those core shadows on the side of the face, so I'm going to go ahead and make selections with the lasso tool and then paint over them on a new layer with the airbrush. That'll give me some control over trapping the paint within a specific shape, and then I can change the composite method to multiply. I can play with the opacity of that layer, and I can help kind of fade it in and make it as dark as I want it to be. If I check my value at the same time, then I can find just enough darkening to give me the result I want. Then I can go ahead and blend out some of those edges to soften them a bit using diffuse blur. I think that really helps to balance out the contrast on the face. I'm going to save as to save a copy of my work, and then I'll go ahead and just merge that shadow layer down with the head. Next, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my smooth palette knife, and I'm going to add a few detailed hairs along the edges here just to kind of clean up that hairline. I might clean up where the hair comes out of the scalp as well. I'll soften that transition with diffuse blur, pulling down following the direction of the hair. The ears have been a little bit neglected, so I'll go ahead and just reshape those a little bit with pinch. Then I can paint over the edge a little bit to clean it up using a very small smooth palette knife. These are small areas that are easy to forget about, so I want to make sure that I put in enough detail here as well. I'll zoom out to see how this is coming together. I'm going to go ahead and go to the canvas layer, which is the background, and I'm going to add a vignette with some darker purple. And in the center, I'll add some of that reddish violet and even some pink color to add a glow in the background. And then on the right side, I'll bring in some of that red light. You certainly could have done this earlier. It really doesn't matter which order you do the background in, but it could be helpful to do the background first. That way, it'll give you a good idea of what the lighting is in your composition, and you can make sure to use those colors on your face. So regardless of which order you do it in, the colors on the face need to match the colors of the background for this to look realistic. Now I'm starting to get even finer with my brush strokes. On the eyes, I'm doing some very small fine details. I noticed that there's a gap between my shirt and my face that I didn't notice until I filled in the background. So I'll select the shirt layer and I'll use the Distorto brush just to push those pixels to remove that gap. Next I'll zoom out and rotate a bit just to be able to evaluate my progress. I think that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to add some more detail to the hair using a smaller brush. That'll help separate those clumps into more individual clumps of hair. And then where the hairs are coming out of the scalp, I can have some of the skin kind of show through in between the hairs. That helps too. Now I want to add some more detail to the shirt. So on the shirt layer, I'm going to select layer content, create a new layer, set that layer to overlay. Then I'll select a dark and a light color, and I'll go ahead and paint using the cylinder pen. That will put a highlight on one side and a shadow on the other, and I can get these nice lumpy shapes. Then I can use diffuse blur to blend over those in some areas to add some softness while keeping a little bit of sharpness so they look like creases in the shirt. Unfortunately, blending near the edges of the canvas pulls in some white fringe, so you'll need to use the Distorto brush to just push that away off of the canvas. Just like I did with the hair and the face, I just want to be adding shadows and highlights wherever they're appropriate, and that helps to build up the form and detail of the shirt. So if you want the fabric to bulge out, use a lighter color. If you want it to sink in, use a darker color. And then on the red side of the shirt, I want those colors to be reddish in hue. Now if I overdo it with the details, I can always knock them back a little bit by adding a vignette with a bigger airbrush just to kind of fade it back into darkness, because we do want the bottom edge just to fade out and not be so noticeable. I can highlight the shoulder there with a bit of a highlight since that's closer to the light source. And now it might be nice to add some texture to the shirt, so I'll right-click on the shirt layer to get a selection from it, create a new layer above it, set the composite method to multiply, turn off preserve transparency, select the random chalk brush. I'm going to select a fabric-looking paper. I'll go ahead and paint with a larger brush. I want to use lighter pressure so I'm not covering it too much. I'm going to undo and try a different paper scale and contrast. I want this to stand out a little bit more. And I'll switch my brush to glazing chalk and I'll paint with that. That adds a nice dark fabric texture. I'll create a new layer, set that to overlay, And I'll use some of the light colors like the purples and the reds just to go ahead and lighten that. I might change the composite method to screen. I think I like that better. Then I'll reduce the opacity of those texture layers just to blend them in with the background. That way I get a light and a dark texture that kind of combine with the base layer. I'll name those layers light texture and dark texture so I know what they are, and I'll group them into a group called shirt texture. I'll go ahead and save my progress. And now I'll repeat that same process on the head layer by selecting it with select layer content, and then creating a new layer to paint on. I'm going to select a brush called Sponge G. I'm going to select a red color. I'm going to set the composite method of that layer to multiply. I'll change my paper texture to something different, let's say simulated wood grain with a high scale and contrast. I'll use a large brush to paint over the face with red and blue, and that creates something that looks like veins or blemishes. I'm going to switch to my eraser and I'll erase it from the eyes and the teeth and the hair and anywhere that shouldn't have that skin texture. I'll create one more layer for texture and I'll go ahead and use a lighter color this time with the sponge. I'll paint on a screen layer and then I'll reduce the opacity of that layer to help blend it in. I'll name those layers so that I know what they are, and I'll go ahead and group them into a group called skin texture. I'm going to add some details to the shirt now to create kind of a seam. Put in a few more smaller details on the face. Then I'll go ahead and use the distortion brushes to correct the face a little bit, smudge it into place. Do a few more fine little brush strokes to clean up the nose and just add a bit more detail. And I can't help but notice that the teeth still need some work, so I'm going to return to the teeth and just try to fix those and get them looking more the way I want them to look. It may have made it a bit easier if I would have separated the teeth from the lips from the inside of the mouth, and sometimes I'll go to that extreme when I'm making layers. In this case, I wanted to be a little bit more loose and a little bit more quick, so I didn't worry about it that much. I feel like the texture is too strong on the shirt texture layers, so I'm going to go ahead and just play with those a little bit. Now it's time for another short break. And back to the painting. I found a few more areas that I wanted to correct, so I'll go ahead and just fix those. The teeth are still not the way I want them, so I need to do some more work on the teeth. This is a good example of resisting trying to draw the teeth the way I imagine them versus the way that they actually look in the reference photo. I'm inclined to want to have the teeth all evenly spaced and with gaps in between them, and they overlap each other in reality and aren't all perfectly straight, so it's up to me to resist doing it the wrong way. I'm going to switch to a brush called Messy Dab, and if I dab with this brush, using a lighter color, I can put in some pores or maybe some shiny oily spots on the skin. This just adds texture to the skin, and then I can blend over it with diffuse blur to soften it a bit. I'll use a small airbrush just to clean up a few of the little details here and there. And then now I think it's time to bring this painting into Photoshop, so I'm going to save it as a PSD. Then I'm going to import it into Photoshop, and on that head layer, I'm going to go to Filter Liquify. And here I can use the Face Aware Liquify, which will let me adjust the eyes individually, the nose, and so on. And so I can just tweak different things. If the eyes are the wrong angle, or they're too close together or too far apart, I can very easily tweak that stuff. I can use the lock icon to move both eyes together, or I can move them individually, and I can really get this looking the way I want. You can use the preview button down here at the bottom to show and hide the preview so you can see the kind of effect that you had. This is going to be pretty subtle, but it definitely makes a difference. So once I'm done, I'll go ahead and save it as a PSD and bring it back into Corel Painter, and I can continue adding detail. And by now, you're seeing that I'm really just repeating the same things over and over and over again, and just really spending a lot of time on it, trying to look at every single area of the face and just make sure that I give it lots of attention in the painting as well. I'm also kind of spicing it up wherever I can. If I see something that looks like it would be interesting, like a certain highlight or a lighting effect, then I'll add that in. I want this to look better than a photograph and way better than my reference photo. I'll use my brush called Digital Airbrush G2, and I'll set the merge mode to overlay, and I'll use red to put in a little bit of life around the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. I could set it to screen and add highlights. I'm going to go back to that Messy Dab brush, and I'll add in a few more little shiny spots here on the skin, and then back to the Digital Airbrush just to add in some more little details. Now I'm going to draw a circular shape with just a stroke and no fill, and I'll use that to check the diameter of my iris, just to make sure those are both pretty round and pretty even. I can move that over and compare it with the other iris. I think I can clean up those eyes just a bit more. I'll add some more finer details to the hair as well, using the smooth palette knife at a very small scale. And we're beginning to get near the end of the painting process, so a lot of what I'm going to be doing is just going to be very, very small, nitpicky stuff. gone ahead and saved a copy of my work again. I'm going to go ahead and maybe add in some of those red-violet colors on the highlights of the shirt. Maybe brighten up the highlights on the shirt on the red side as well. And brighten the side of the ear to help it stand out from the background color. Now I want to use the blur blender just to go ahead and go along some of the edges that are farthest away from us in three-dimensional space to help those kind of look a little bit out of focus. Do that on the shoulders as well, and on the base of the shirt just to kind of fade that out, along the jawline, around the hairline, just anywhere where it's too sharp and I want to soften it a bit. I also want to spend some time doing some final distortion just to kind of push things around and get them looking a little bit more perfect. If you want to see how much of a difference this kind of stuff makes, go back and look at your older versions of your saves in sequence and see how the face evolves over time. It should get more and more accurate, hopefully. So now I'm going to be zooming out a bit, rotating, checking my value, and just really making sure that I don't miss anything major. At a certain point, you start to come up on really not being able to do much in a reasonable amount of time to change the overall value or the overall effectiveness of your portrait. And so you could spend hours and hours and hours and hours on very, very tiny little details that most people wouldn't even be bothered by. So I'm going to save as PSD again so I can bring this into Photoshop and liquefy, distort the face a little bit more, just to tweak it. I just want to get everything looking as good as I can. And then I'll save and go back into Corel Painter. I'm going to flip the canvas a little bit. I might even make a selection around the entire head and just darken right along the edges of the hair using an airbrush, just to fade those back into darkness, because the light's kind of coming toward the front of the face, not really from the top or the back. I'll go ahead and just add a little bit more lightness to the shirt. Maybe play with that a little bit. I always have trouble knowing what to say for these last steps because it's really just kind of like work on it until it looks good, and then if you think it's done, then it's done. And, you know, don't be too hasty. Come back and look at it after spending some time away from it, and you might get a fresh perspective on it. But don't overthink it. So this is most of the finishing touches that I'm putting in right now. And I know since I sped up the footage, it seems like I did this in a pretty remarkable amount of time. Overall, I spent about 7 or 8 hours total on this painting. I could have spent a lot more time on it, but would it have made the painting that much better? It's really hard to say. Let's say that this is about 90% how I want it to be. If I wanted to get that extra 1% to get it 91%, that might take another hour. If I wanted to get it to 98%, that might take me another 7 or 8 hours. And I have to weigh out whether or not it's worth it, because you might find that you might get the same amount of likes or make the same amount of sales selling prints of something that you spent 8 hours on as something that you spent 16 hours on. So as a final step, I'm going to hold Alt to invoke the color sampler, and I'm just going to drag around the different colors in my painting and just look in the compact color selector and just make sure that those are all staying kind of within the proper hue of my color gamut. I'm sure they probably are, but it's always good just to double check and make sure you didn't add any colors that are outside of your gamut, otherwise it might kind of throw everything off. So I'm going to say that's a finished painting. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as to save my final copy. Oh wait, no I'm not. I'm going to add one more little spot to the eye. Okay, there, now it's perfect. And here's the final result. So now what I plan to do with this is transform this into a werewolf version, and then draw some in-between kind of transformation stages, and then create an animation of myself transforming into a werewolf. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, check out those videos.